Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7.
Yeah, today we're stepping into a pretty intense ring.
Because the punches here aren't physical, but they might just completely shatter your worldview. Today we're looking at a massive collision between two intellectual heavyweights, Jordan Peterson and Matt Dillahunty.
Right. You have Peterson, the psychologist, who firmly believes civilization is held together by ancient myths.
And then Dillahunty, who's this really hard-nosed skeptic demanding raw evidence for absolutely everything.
And they are clashing over the existence of God, the roots of morality, and whether atheism inevitably leads to chaos.
It really is this brutal battle between the metaphorical substrate of religion and the cold, hard skepticism of secular humanism.
It's a fight between what's evolutionarily useful versus what's factually real.
Exactly. And before we jump into the ring, if you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button.
So let's unpack this. We have a transcript in front of us titled "The Greatest God Debate in History."
Which is quite the title, right? It's a massive claim. Does the actual content even earn that title, or is it just, clickbait?
Honestly, I think it earns it.
Really?
Yeah, but not because they actually solve the God question once and for all. It earns it because it's just this perfect storm of opposing personalities.
Right, you have these two completely different frameworks colliding.
Exactly. On one side, you have Jordan Peterson. And you have to understand, he isn't arguing like a priest or a theologian would.
No, he's coming at it from this angle of evolutionary psychology and literature.
Right. To him, religion isn't just a list of rules you follow on Sunday. He views it as the software that Western civilization has been running on for thousands of years.
Okay, so he's looking purely at the utility of the belief rather than the actual factual history of it.
Spot on. And then right in the other corner, you have Matt Dillahunty.
Who brings a completely different energy.
Oh, absolutely. Dillahunty is a veteran debater, right?
Yeah.
But the key context here, the thing you really need to keep in mind, is his personal history.
Because he used to be a believer.
Yes, he was a Southern Baptist. He was a believer who actually wanted to be a minister.
Wow, so he was deep in it.
Very deep. He says he genuinely felt what he thought was the Holy Spirit. But then he started really looking for evidence. Hard empirical proof.
And he realized he couldn't find any.
Exactly. So he's coming at this debate with a very specific, almost zero-tolerance attitude. It's basically, show me the proof or I walk.
Which makes the whole dynamic so tense. And the mission of this deep dive today is to really dissect how these two men define the concept of truth.
Because that is exactly where they crash into each other over and over again.
Right. For Dillahunty, truth is simply, does this map to reality?
Yes. And for Peterson, truth seems to be, is this useful for survival?
So let's get into that fundamental disconnect, because when you're listening to this, you really get the sense that they are speaking two entirely different languages.
Oh, they absolutely are. Dillahunty starts off right out of the gate trying to pin Peterson down.
Yeah, he basically asks him, okay, but is there actually a God? Like a real being?
Right, a consciousness outside of space and time.
He wants a straight answer.
He wants a yes or no on the factual claim. But Peterson totally refuses to play that game.
He just sidesteps it entirely.
Yeah, instead he pivots to this concept of the metaphorical substrate.
The metaphorical substrate. Which, that sounds incredibly academic. How do we even break that down for someone who doesn't have a PhD in Jungian psychology?
It's actually not too bad if you think of it like a computer operating system.
Okay, I'm tracking.
So when you use a computer, you don't interact with the binary code, right? The zeros and ones.
No, of course not. That would be impossible.
Exactly. You interact with icons, folders, a desktop. That interface is what allows you to use the computer effectively.
Right.
Well, Peterson argues that religious stories, ideas about God, heaven, hell, divine judgment, those are the user interface for human survival.
Oh, I see.
He argues that our laws, our deepest values, even just the way we treat strangers on the street, are all nested in this ancient religious framework.
So he's essentially saying that even if the zeros and ones of a literal God aren't physically there, the interface itself is real because it governs how we act.
Precisely. He actually calls it a domain of religious phenomenology.
That's a mouthful.
It is, but his point is that you can't just rip the idea of God out of society.
Yeah.
You can't just uninstall the operating system without the whole computer crashing.
Because we don't know how to run on anything else.
Right. To Peterson, if a belief helps a species survive and cooperate over millions of years, that belief contains a form of Darwinian truth.
Okay, I get the logic. It's deeply pragmatic. But I can entirely see why Dillahunty would hate that answer.
Oh, he absolutely despises it.
Because to a skeptic, it just feels like dodging the core question.
And Dillahunty isn't buying the pivot for a single second. His sticking point is actually hilarious, but it's very sharp.
What does he say?
He basically looks at Peterson and says, I don't care if the story makes you feel good.
Right.
I don't care if it helps you build a library or be a nice neighbor. I want to know if the story is true.
It's like the difference between a map that helps you drive safely and a map that accurately shows the real terrain.
That's a brilliant analogy.
Yeah.
Peterson is basically saying, look, this map gets us to the destination without crashing, so it's a true map.
While Dillahunty is saying, yeah, but this map shows a giant bridge where there is literally no bridge.
Exactly. Dillahunty argues it's factually false, even if we somehow got lucky and arrived safely anyway.
And this is where Dillahunty brings up his Baptist background, right?
Yeah.
Which I thought was a really crucial piece of context for the whole discussion.
It really grounds his frustration. He points out that the people he knew growing up, the people who are actively voting and passing legislation based on the Bible, they are not thinking about it as a metaphorical substrate.
No, definitely not.
They aren't treating it as psychological drama. They think there's literally a guy in the sky who hates certain things.
Right, they are literalists.
Yes. And Dillahunty is arguing that Peterson, by using all this fancy academic language, is basically giving intellectual cover to fundamentalism.
It really does feel like Peterson is playing four-dimensional chess with human psychology, while Dillahunty is just pointing at an empty chair in the room and saying, hey, there's nobody sitting there.
That is the perfect summary of the first 20 minutes. Peterson argues it's not easy to distinguish between what's useful and what's real.
But Dillahunty is a strict evidentialist. He only wants to know if the watching God is actually there, not just if the fear of a watching God makes us behave better.
And this is exactly where the debate takes a completely unexpected hard left turn.
Yeah, because you'd expect a debate about the existence of God to stay focused on theology or maybe physics.
Right.
But suddenly we are deep into a conversation about magic mushrooms.
Yes, the psychedelic tangent. This was Peterson's attempt to provide that hard evidence Dillahunty was asking for, but in a very specific, very Petersonian way.
So Peterson brings up these clinical studies on psilocybin, and he focuses specifically on smoking cessation.
Which is fascinating in itself.
It is. Apparently, the studies show that if you give people psilocybin and it induces a mystical experience, they quit smoking at an incredibly high rate.
Something like an 85% success rate.
Which is staggering. That's way higher than nicotine patches or standard therapy.
It's a massive statistical anomaly. And Peterson's argument here is actually really compelling. He says, look at this. This experience fundamentally alters their personality.
It changes their trait openness.
Yes, and it completely stops a severe chemical addiction. It has a real-world, biological, highly measurable effect.
So his logic is essentially because the effect is undeniably real, the cause, meaning the mystical experience itself, must point to something functionally real.
Exactly. He's arguing that biological beings are hardwired to interface with this divine layer of reality.
Like we have a specific receptor for it.
Right. If the brain has a built-in receptor for a God experience, Peterson asks, doesn't that imply the God experience is a fundamental part of reality?
He's trying to build a bridge directly between biology and theology.
Yeah, but Dillahunty, Peterson really set him up for the best moment of the entire night here.
Oh, the super strawberry.
The super strawberry. It's a classic Matt Dillahunty moment.
It's so good.
He essentially dismantles this whole experience equals reality argument with a single absurd anecdote.
So for the listeners who haven't heard this clip, Dillahunty freely admits, yeah, I've done LSD.
Right.
And he tells the story about being in a bathroom, just staring closely at the wood grain on the door.
As you do.
Right. And suddenly he sees a strawberry, but not just a normal piece of fruit. He sees a strawberry wearing a cape.
The super strawberry.
Exactly. And it flies all around his head, leaves this glowing trail, and then smacks right back into the wood grain of the door.
It's completely absurd, but the underlying logic is devastating to Peterson's point.
How so?
Because Dillahunty is saying, look, I had a profound, incredibly vivid experience. I physically saw the strawberry. I could describe the fabric of its cape.
Right.
But having that vivid experience does not mean a super strawberry actually exists out there in the universe.
It just means his brain chemistry was temporarily altered.
Exactly.
That is a really tough counterargument, because if we accept Peterson's logic that the smoking cessation success proves the mystical experience is real in an objective sense, Do we then also have to accept that the super strawberry is real just because Dillahunty vividly experienced it?
Well, Peterson would probably argue that the super strawberry didn't permanently change Dillahunty's life or his moral structure, so it's less true than the mystical experience that cures an addiction.
But Dillahunty's core point still stands firm. Internal experience, no matter how profound or life-altering, is not evidence of external supernatural reality.
It's that clash again, internal phenomenon versus external fact. Dillahunty is saying, just because the software glitch in my brain was cool, doesn't mean there's an actual ghost in the machine.
And this philosophical clash leads us directly into what I think is the highest stakes part of the whole conversation: morality.
Yes, the age-old question.
Because if we fully accept Dillahunty's view that there is absolutely no God, no divine substrate, just brain chemistry and physics, Peterson asks the really big question.
What stops you from being a monster?
Exactly. And this is where Peterson introduces the Sam Harris on the stage thought experiment.
Right, Sam Harris being another very famous atheist author that both of these guys know well.
So Peterson looks right at Dillahunty and basically asks, why don't you just throw Sam Harris off the stage?
It's a provocative way of asking, if you want to win an argument and you truly believe there is no God to judge you after you die, why not just use violence to get your way?
And Peterson's own answer to that is that the only reason Dillahunty behaves morally is because he is unconsciously acting out a Judeo-Christian ethic.
Yes, he calls it standing on the shoulders of giants.
Meaning, Dillahunty is using the software of Christianity, things like compassion, the inherent value of the individual, while completely denying that the programmer ever existed.
Exactly. Peterson genuinely believes that if you delete the God file from society, the human rights file eventually gets corrupted and disappears right along with it.
He thinks atheists are essentially freeloading on the moral capital built by religion over millennia.
That's his view. But Dillahunty rejects this premise entirely, and he counters it by bringing in the chess analogy.
Which I honestly think is the strongest argument for secular morality I've ever heard.
It's incredibly elegant.
Walk us through the chess analogy, because you constantly hear people say, without God, morality is just entirely subjective opinion. How does Dillahunty get around that?
Dillahunty says, look at the game of chess. The rules of chess are completely arbitrary. Humans made them up out of thin air.
Right.
There is no god of chess who came down from the heavens and decreed that knights must move in an L shape.
We just invented the game.
We invented it. However, and this is the crucial part, once we collectively agree on the goal of the game, which is, I want to win, or at least I don't want to lose.
Right.
Once that goal is set, there are suddenly objectively good and bad moves.
Okay, I see exactly where this is going. If I move my queen to a spot where it immediately gets captured by a pawn, that is an objectively bad move.
Yes.
Not because a god said it's a sin to lose your queen, but simply because it violates the established goal of the game.
Precisely. And Dillahunty applies this exact logic to human life. He says, if we as a society agree that the goal is human well-being and thriving,
then suddenly an action like murder is objectively a bad move.
it's just terrible strategy. It actively reduces well-being. It breaks the game. You don't need a stone tablet from a mountain to tell you that murder is bad. You can figure it out through pure reason and observing the consequences.
And there is a massive advantage to this secular view, isn't there? This is where Dillahunty mentions the idea of Bible 2.0.
Yes. This is the concept of patching our morality, like software.
Right.
In a strictly religious system, the rules are revealed once, and they are static.
Meaning they don't change.
Exactly. If the ancient book says slavery is okay, you are stuck trying to justify slavery forever.
But in Dillahunty's chess model, if we learn over time that a certain rule is actually hurting the game, like slavery or discrimination, we can update the rules.
We just release Morality 2.0 based on new evidence of what promotes well-being.
So Peterson is arguing for a static, revealed truth that keeps us firmly anchored, while Dillahunty is arguing for a self-correcting system based purely on measurable results.
That's the core of it. Peterson fears that without that heavy divine anchor, we just drift into absolute chaos.
And Dillahunty argues that with the anchor, we are permanently chained to the moral mistakes of the Bronze Age.
Speaking of drifting into chaos, we really have to talk about the most controversial clip from this entire debate.
Oh, I know the one. This is where Peterson basically looks Dillahunty dead in the eye and tells him, "You're not actually an atheist."
Yes. And the tension in the room during this moment was palpable. It feels incredibly dismissive to sit across from a professional atheist and tell him he isn't one.
But to really understand what Peterson is getting at, you have to look at his literary background.
Right. He heavily references Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky.
It's specifically the character Raskolnikov.
Exactly. Raskolnikov is the protagonist of the novel, and he decides that since he believes there is no God, he is therefore not bound by any traditional moral law.
All right.
So he rationalizes murdering this old pawnbroker to steal her money, reasoning that he can use that stolen money to do good deeds later.
He really believes he is a sort of Superman who is entirely above the rule.
Yes. And Peterson claims that this character, Raskolnikov, is what a true atheist actually is.
A literal murderer.
According to Peterson, yes. He says a true atheist is someone who has fully integrated the idea that there are absolutely no divine consequences.
Someone who realizes that without God, everything is morally permissible and then actually has the nerve to act on it.
Exactly. Because Dillahunty is a genuinely nice guy, because he clearly has empathy and follows the law, Peterson says to him, "See? You are acting out the religious substrate. You aren't acting like Raskolnikov. Therefore, deep down in your actions, you are not actually an atheist."
I mean, I can practically hear Dillahunty grinding his teeth from here.
Oh, he was not happy.
He calls this the no true Scotsman fallacy, doesn't he?
He does. He argues that Peterson is just completely redefining the word atheist to mean psychopath.
Which isn't what the word means.
Not at all. Dillahunty's definition is extremely simple. An atheist is just someone who isn't convinced that a God exists.
That's it.
That's the whole definition. You don't have to be a nihilist or a murderer. You can be an atheist who loves puppies, donates to charity, and pays your taxes.
And this whole disagreement spills over into politics, too. Because Peterson always points to the Soviet Union. He brings up Stalin and the gulags as the inevitable end result of a godless society.
That is his ultimate historical warning.
He says when you kill the myth of God, the state simply becomes God. And that always ends in rivers of blood.
He genuinely believes humans are inherently religious animals. So if you remove a traditional God, you will inevitably just worship the political leader or the party, leading straight to tyranny.
But Dillahunty counters that historical point very effectively, I think.
He really does. Dillahunty says, look at Stalin, look at Mao. Those were not societies built on secular humanism or skeptical inquiry.
No, they were incredibly dogmatic.
Exactly. They were deeply authoritarian. They treated the state and the ideology exactly like a fundamentalist religion.
You couldn't question the leader, and you certainly couldn't question the doctrine.
So Dillahunty argues that the actual problem there wasn't a lack of God. The problem was forced dogma.
Right. Whether that dogma happens to be religious or political, the danger is the absolute certainty without evidence.
Exactly. It is a fundamental clash between believing that the ancient story keeps us safe, which is Peterson's view, versus believing that reason and skepticism keep us safe, which is Dillahunty's view.
So we've covered magic mushrooms, chess games, fictional Russian murderers, and super strawberries.
It's been quite the journey.
After all of that, did they actually manage to agree on anything at all? Or was it just 90 straight minutes of them talking past each other?
Surprisingly, they did find some common ground.
Really? Where?
On the underlying biology of belief. They both seem to agree on the concept of the hyperactive agency detector.
The HAD. That's a concept from evolutionary psychology, right?
Yes. It's the idea that imagine you are an early human walking on the savannah thousands of years ago.
Okay.
You hear a rustle in the bushes nearby. Now, it could just be the wind, or it could be a hungry tiger.
Right.
If you assume it's the wind, but it's actually a tiger, you die. You're out of the gene pool.
Game over.
But if you assume it's a tiger and it turns out to just be the wind, well, you just look a little silly. But you survive to pass on your genes.
So over time, we naturally evolved to always assume tiger. We evolved to assume there is an agent or a mind behind the noise.
Exactly. We are biologically wired to over-detect agency. It's why we see faces in the clouds or imagine ghosts in an empty house.
And Dillahunty argues that this specific biological glitch is what gave birth to religion.
Right. Early humans saw a massive thunderstorm and immediately assumed a storm god caused it. They detected agency where there was only physics.
Now, Peterson agrees with the biological mechanism of that.
He does.
But he thinks that glitch is actually a crucial feature, not a bug.
Yes. He thinks that tendency to personify the natural world is exactly what helps us structure our reality, build narratives, and ultimately survive as a cohesive society.
So they agree entirely on the hardware. They just completely disagree on whether the resulting software is a destructive virus or an essential app.
That is a fantastic way to put it. They also completely agreed that blind dogma is inherently dangerous.
But despite those agreements, the final standoff between them remained pretty absolute.
It really did. Peterson walked away believing that you absolutely need the myth to ground your rationality. He thinks rationality all by itself just eats itself and descends into nihilism.
While Dillahunty firmly believes that rationality and empathy are entirely sufficient to build a good society, and that the ancient myth is just unnecessary baggage that confuses us.
If I had to synthesize this whole debate, I'd say this wasn't really a debate about God in the traditional theological sense.
No, it didn't feel like it.
It was a clash between a worldview prioritized entirely on meaning, that's Peterson, versus a worldview prioritized entirely on fact, and that's Dillahunty.
Right. Peterson is absolutely terrified of a meaningless world.
And Dillahunty is absolutely terrified of an untrue one.
And honestly, looking at the state of the world right now, both of those fears seem pretty valid. It makes you wonder which one is actually the bigger threat to us.
It really does.
So here is a final provocative thought for you to mull over as you go about your day. If we stripped away all religious stories tomorrow, would our moral chess game collapse, or would we just keep playing by the rules of empathy? Thanks for listening. Catch you next time.